Dr. Jarman, as you and your counterparts have testified, the 2020 census certainly faced unprecedented challenges, including delaying in-person counting by about 3 months, adapting your operations to the pandemic, facing interference as a result of directives from the previous administration that led to large-scale schedule changes. And we know any kind of change in long-established plans creates more risk and more error. So my question to you is, given all of the challenges and changes, how did the Bureau decide in 2021 that it needed more time for processing the data, and why do Bureau experts believe this total amount of time was necessary?
Well, thank you, Chair. So I think first and foremost, our objective is to release complete and accurate information. And so that drives many of our operational decisions last year and drives our decisions right now about how we're processing the data. So when we looked at where we were in the schedule and what still needed to be done, I think that's what drives the dates that we've announced. So the apportionment data will come out at the end of April. Maybe we might beat that by a little bit, and then, the final redistricting data by the end of September. But that includes a bunch of software updates that make the data, easy to access and utilize. And so that's why we did make the decision to produce similar data that we produced in 2010 and make that available in August, because obviously, we're trying to get the data to the states as quickly as we can.
Yeah, absolutely, and they're eagerly awaiting the information. As you know.
Let us know that.
Mr. Mim, GAO studied the risk of a compressed data processing schedule last year. What are those risks? What can happen if the Bureau does not have enough time to run full quality checks on the data? Paint that picture for me.
Well, Mr. Chairman, the challenge that the Bureau faces is that it's a once-a-decade operation with no opportunity for a do-over and very little opportunity for changes on the fly. And in fact, one of the strengths of the census, when it's done right, is that it will be done consistently across the country in a uniform manner. What late design changes do is at first it runs the risk, or it introduces untested approaches. And second, it then requires that those untested approaches be cascaded down and uniformly implemented across the country. That's always a very difficult operation to do. Maintaining for the Census Bureau just control in a normal circumstance can be difficult to do. It gets exceedingly difficult when you're implementing changes on top of that. As you were mentioning, coming into the field, going out of the field, going back into the field, and can be very, very difficult.
Some of the most spotty data, which the Bureau still has to work through, as you know, is for the most vulnerable constituents, nursing home residents, homeless people, people impacted by natural disasters. How can the Census Bureau be particularly vigilant through the end of the census to make sure that vulnerable and hard-to-count individuals, which I mentioned in my opening comments, are roughly 800,000 people in Michigan, how are these groups going to be properly accounted for during this difficult time?
Counting these individuals, and it's the hard-to-enumerate population, is among the most difficult parts of the census, as you were saying. The Bureau did run into challenges in getting people and getting counts out of what they refer to as group quarters, which would be skilled nursing facilities, homelessness shelters, or shelters that, or for persons experiencing homelessness, prisons. And in fact, one of the innovations, and I think this is a positive development, is that when they had over 24,000 of these group quarters that were reporting zero data, they went back out in December to try and confirm that and try and get better data from this. Because as you mentioned, this is a very vulnerable population. It's hard to count in the best of circumstances. And when you had a number of these group quarters, especially those providing services that may have closed down or people that weren't familiar with the technology used to report back to the Census Bureau, that's what led them to have to go back out and reach out to these in late December.
Mr. Marinos, the 2020 census has a massive IT and cybersecurity operation. 52 different systems, in fact, are used to collect and protect the data. The Bureau has worked very closely, I know, with the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, commonly known as CISA, at DHS to strengthen its cybersecurity. But could you describe to the committee how this relationship was unprecedented in many respects, and as we look across the kind of the government cybersecurity ecosystem, and what can we learn from this collaboration that will be helpful going forward?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that is, I think, a good way to put it. It is certainly unprecedented, and it's also lengthy in its history. The Bureau and CISA began coordinating several years ago. So in the lead up to key 2020 operations, CISA had already been on site to perform threat assessments and vulnerability assessments for the Bureau and provided recommendations, feedback to the Bureau so that they could take action to improve the protections of their systems. In addition to that, as key operations were starting up, CISA shifted to more active relationship with the Bureau, actually having dedicated staff within CISA available to provide assistance when needed to the Bureau as it was starting up things like the Internet Self-Response last March. And so I think what we've seen here is a really good model for how CISA could be leveraged for other key operations within the federal government, not only during key operations, but in the lead up. Providing that feedback is important, and most importantly, what we've seen the Bureau do over the last couple of years, in response also to a recommendation we made, was take to heart that feedback that it got from CISA. So it's not only about CISA providing the recommendations, but seeing the agencies take it and improve their systems, which is what we did see the Bureau do.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Very good to hear. Final question, Dr. Jarman. Is it correct that there have been no data breaches or significant cybersecurity incidents related to the 2020 census operations thus far?
That is correct. I mean, we did work hard, as Mr. Marinos said, to work with all of the expert groups from CISA, folks at the Department of Commerce, but also with private sector companies to make sure that we, sort of made sure that we had all of the bases covered to make sure that either cyber threats or misinformation, disinformation threats would pose a threat to the census.
Well, it's good to hear. Thank you, Dr. Jarman.